Morning, everyone. Thank you for those that have joined so far. We're just going to allow a couple of minutes to allow people to move from their previous meetings onto this one and grab a tea or a coffee or something. So we'll aim to make a start around 2 minutes past. So we'll speak to you then. Right, that's 2 minutes past, so I think we're ready to make a start of it. First of all, thank you all for joining us this morning for this webinar. Today we're going to be talking about AI buzzwords, and we're going to be using the exciting format of bingo to help kind of guide us through the different buzzwords that we're going to be talking about, and using that to kind of focus in on various different areas of the topic. So your presenters today, so myself, so I head up the data science and AI function at Telefónica Tech, so I'll be talking about all things AI, and also joined by my colleague Stephen, who sits as part of our advisory team as well. So we'll be hearing from himself as well in a short while. Before we get into the main content, just a bit of housekeeping really. So first thing to say is that you'll receive the slides and the recording of the session if you signed up to this shortly after the event taking place. So we'll get through to make sure we've got all the bits in there that you need, and make sure we get those kind of follow-ups back out to you. With the webinar platform, there is a Q&A function, so feel free to drop any questions that you might have in there as we go through. Also, with this particular webinar, so we're going to be talking about a number of different buzzwords. We've kind of selected a few that we're going to talk about based on a few polls and votes that we've put out onto LinkedIn. But if you have others that you see on there that you really want to focus on, if there's time at the end, then we'll try and get through a few more of those buzzwords as well. So feel free to post any other buzzwords that you might be thinking about that are on those slides, and we can try and tackle those as well. And just to make sure that we can get through all the content smoothly, everyone on the call will be muted. But as I say, feel free to use the Q&A function if you have questions you want to raise, and we'll try and get to those at the end. Cool. So we've got quite a packed agenda this morning. We've got quite a lot to get through. So what we'll start talking about is the kind of the headline buzzwords. So we're all familiar with, you know, AI buzzwords being all over the place at the moment, and there's quite a lot of noise in the market around AI. So just kind of framing that a little bit, and why we wanted to kind of take this approach to kind of looking at AI, and why it's important to try and talk about those buzzwords and really make clear what those things are. We'll then talk about kind of 3 of those kind of key buzzwords that we've identified, which will be a little session around agentic AI, what that means and what that looks like. We'll also focus on AI maturity and what that looks like for organizations and how people can tackle that. And then we'll also look at things like agent-to-agent communications, which is a slightly more technical topic, but we'll talk about what that means and why it's so important when people are looking at things like agentic AI. We'll then pass over to Stephen, who's going to talk a bit about how we can actually start to make tangible kind of steps on our way to really building up kind of things like AI maturity and tackling agentic AI approaches. So moving kind of from the sort of bingo format into more of how do we actually establish what that journey looks like with the building blocks. Before we go into kind of a wrap up where, as I say, we'll hopefully tackle a few of your questions and any other buzzwords that you might have as well. So without any further ado, so as we are all aware, anyone that is across sort of LinkedIn or even sort of national press, media will be very, very familiar with all the different kind of AI themes and topics and buzzwords that are coming through. And whether that is, you know, you're looking at that from a technical perspective to understand the latest kind of frameworks, the latest kind of model architectures, the latest sort of iterations of the various different models that we're all familiar with, or more from a kind of a strategic perspective about how do you actually leverage the benefits that AI gets us? How do we make the most of the kind of the AI revolution that we're experiencing at the moment. AI is obviously absolutely everywhere, and we also see so much in that kind of content. A lot of the kind of the buzzwords being pushed at us that we feel we need to kind of constantly be keeping up with and constantly understanding what these buzzwords mean, so that we can actually make sense of kind of what we need to understand and what we can actually leave by the wayside as kind of non-important. So obviously AI is being used everywhere. It's also being kind of conflated and slightly sort of used across different terminologies. So we talk of things like agentic AI and machine learning, but also things like co-pilots and digital workers. So all of these things are kind of related to the field of AI, but what do they sort of really mean? And a lot of what we see actually in AI today is essentially intelligent automation. So a lot of agentic AI focuses around how do we automate things, but blend in aspects of intelligence into that process. But those things can also be brittle. So there's also a bit of a trade-off when we're looking at things like automation to understand how do we trust an AI to do the things that it needs to do, but also balance in the things around kind of making sure it's actually going to be reliable and be slightly deterministic where possible. What we see is that the differentiator is definitely not the model itself. It's more about the data and the processes that underpin those AI models, and how we sort of manage those models against a process or against an objective we're trying to achieve is really where the key differentiator comes into play. And that's why we think it's so important to kind of talk about AI in a more general term and look at the different buzzwords at play, because it's not always about just the model or just about one aspect. It's really about tackling the topic as a whole. So we're going to try and look across a few different topics today and talk about what those really mean. So as we can see, AI buzzwords are everywhere. These are kind of the selection of buzzwords that we presented to a few LinkedIn polls to kind of try and determine what buzzwords people were really interested in and what people wanted to have kind of demystified and broken down for them. What we did was we put out these polls on LinkedIn. We asked people, out of things like data readiness, AI maturity, prioritization, and AI skills, what are people most interested in? And the feedback was that AI maturity was the kind of the key winner there. When we looked at different search engine trends, we found that agentic AI is by far the most kind of search trend across things like agentic AI, data science, and machine learning. And again, relying on those kind of LinkedIn polls, we determined that agent-to-agent communication was actually a key thing that people are looking to try and understand, and kind of as a technical concept, how can that be broken down and made clear? So what you'll see as we go through today is that we're going to tackle kind of those three topics with focus. But as I say, if you want to try and throw in some of those other buzzwords, then we can also try and tackle those at the end as well. So our first kind of buzzword on the bingo board is AI maturity. So when we talk about AI maturity, when we look at the sort of the UK as a whole, the AI maturity currently is seen as kind of low to moderate by comparison to other areas of the world. And the way that kind of plays out is that a lot of people in the UK, roughly 80%, are using AI tools every day, but only about a quarter of those have actually had any kind of formal training or any kind of formal guidance on how to use those AI tools effectively, how to make sure they're not kind of burning through budget and burning tokens, how to make sure they are generating reliable outputs and being told how much and where to apply kind of healthy skepticism and where to kind of trust those outputs. When we shift that to an organizational setting, we can see that almost 90% of business leaders believe that adopting AI is going to give them the benefits that they want to see in their organization. It is going to help them deliver that plan or deliver that objective. But only about 40% see an urgent lack of AI literacy. So when they're looking to their organization for the skills to build out that agentic AI platform or that solution, there is an urgent lack of AI literacy and capability to be able to actually go and tackle that in a realistic and meaningful sense. And one of the most kind of shocking statistics that I've seen here is that about 42% of people operating AI solutions inside of businesses actually apply a human level of review to the outputs that they're generating, actually apply that sort of healthy skepticism and think about what has just been generated. Is that accurate, or are there hallucinations present? Can I trust the data that's been generated for me by this AI? Or do I need to go and have another think about it? And if 42% of people are actually not doing that, that's a big risk of content going out that is not properly supervised. So what does that really mean then? So when we think about this in the organizational setting, it really means, number one, that there's going to be unmet expectations about the impact and effectiveness of AI. People are going to start asking questions as, why hasn't AI automated this already? Without understanding of kind of what AI can and can't do, there is this kind of assumption that AI should be able to do almost anything in an organizational setting now. There's always that kind of sort of misconception, why can't AI do this and that for me already? And why am I not using it to do this and that other thing? And it may be that there's valid reasons why AI won't do that thing. Of course, we're seeing, massive expansive rollouts of things like Copilot or, other kind of enterprise AI subscriptions to kind of develop productivity. So kind of this feeling of, well, everyone's got that license, where's that productivity? Why am I not seeing the benefit of those licenses in my day-to-day organization? And again, understanding that, just giving someone a license doesn't necessarily empower them to use that tool most effectively is a really, really important aspect of AI maturity. The other thing, of course, a lot of people have seen the demos, we've seen the sort of shiny demos from various different AI vendors, but then trying to actually shift that into a setting where it works for your organization with your processes and your data is a whole different challenge. So there is that kind of feeling of like, well, I've seen it work, on the demo, why can't it work in my organization? The other part of this is actually, organizations struggling to determine the best route for adoption. So where AI is a relatively new technology, certainly at the scale that we're trying to roll it out at the moment, there is a bit of uncertainty about, well, what should we be doing? What AI should we be using? How should we actually be building it? How should we approach this particular problem? So a lot of these come down to questions around things like, what actually are we trying to solve? Is AI appropriate for this particular use case? Obviously, every vendor has their own slight flavor of AI. Which one is better? Which one is currently the market leader? Which one does this use case better than that use case? There's a whole myriad of different solutions that we can choose from. So how do we know which one is actually the right one for us at this time? And of course, also, we're seeing an explosion of kind of AI strategy documents, but does that actually deliver on the strategic outcomes? Does it actually lay that pathway for determining the best route for adoption and understanding the right ways to tackle AI in the business? And the last thing, of course, is that sort of lack of trust in AI usage and governance mechanisms. So people often think, well, if I'm using AI, how do I know that data is safe and secure? If my business is starting to go online and use kind of shadow AI, how do I know that they're not passing, potentially sensitive information out into those AIs and they're not then being used to train those AIs further and they've got our data and our IP as part of them? Of course, how can we protect against hallucinations? How do we make sure that our workforce are not generating content that is potentially, incorrect? And of course, who is using AI? Who in the business is actually using AI? What are they actually doing with it? What prompts are they passing in? What data are they passing in? And where are they applying those kind of AI tool sets? So in terms of developing AI maturity, I think it's really important to understand what is the things that we should be thinking about and what things are actually a little bit about sort of a bit more noise that we don't really need to think about or focus on initially. And the first thing is that it's actually less important to know precisely how AI works versus actually knowing what AI is good at, particularly in reference to what your business does in its industry or in its sector. And this is kind of to say, look, we don't need to really all be, AI experts, AI engineers, AI researchers to actually know what AI is good at and to be able to get good results from it. So if we know that AI is good at things like summarization, detecting patterns, drafting content, we can really still apply that knowledge without knowing exactly how the model works. So to say here that, we don't need to dive into the details of how large language models generate the content that they do. We need to know what they're good at and how we can use that to our benefit in the business. The other things that I often struggle with myself is, trying to keep up with every single microstep and iteration of some sort of AI architecture or AI framework or kind of AI model is actually really, really time consuming and exhausting. And actually that's much less important than being able to establish those kind of benchmarks and having a stable AI solution. Even if it turns out that actually you're not the most up-to-date model, you haven't got the latest release of whatever framework you're using, but if you've got an established benchmark and a stable AI platform, it's actually a much better place to be than constantly trying to iterate with the market and keep up with all the different shifts that are happening. And the last thing I'll say is that, yes, of course, it's important to monitor AI usage and understand what people are using AI for and the kind of prompts they're using. But I'd say it's actually less important to scrutinize every single AI interaction that happens across your organization. And actually more important, certainly in the first instance, to encourage your workforce to have that kind of healthy skepticism and encourage them to put people towards that kind of human review approach. So that actually, rather than you trying to monitor every single action, you've actually got your workforce out there doing that work for you. They're looking at the AI, they're being curious about whether that is correct or not, how it might have generated that particular statement or that particular piece of data. So by encouraging that skepticism, you're actually encouraging that mindset which is going to work better when you're adopting an AI platform. And then when we think about sort of going out and trying to develop that AI maturity, when we kind of think about our sort of, the players that we've got on the pitch in terms of what's going to actually make a difference. So we've obviously got our kind of our frontline business users. So things we might expect to see from a sort of a mature AI organization would be things like users checking their facts and validating the accuracy of AI, being able to actually go and scrutinize what that AI is producing and understand whether that is accurate or not. Obviously, things like business users being able to submit ideas to sort of like an AI working group or something like that. So they're actually able to sort of crowdsource those kind of AI use cases that are going to make a difference. And obviously teams kind of showing prompts, showing those kind of practical usage tips as well. Sort of backing that up then is things that the organization can do to help move that forward. So conducting things like AI envisioning workshops to talk about where AI might fit best and what might be the next kind of capabilities you want to develop. Also leaders showing their kind of AI success stories and sort of being ambassadors for AI adoption. And then underpinning all of that, of course, is a healthy level of kind of monitoring and auditing to make sure you've got reliable outputs. And also the developers and the makers in that organization being able to build and test prototypes that are going to be then rolled out across the organization in stages. In terms of developing a pathway, the things that we think are really important, first of all, is develop that AI fluency. Talk about things about prompting, look at how things should be evaluated, think about how we can decompose tasks into their different steps. Also focus on collaboration and recycling. So recycle those prompts, recycle those approaches so that you've got those tried and tested methods. Always be thinking about use cases. So use cases are your kind of guiding light on how you're going to actually define what AI does for your organization. So get those use cases in, understanding where they're going to add impact and understanding how that kind of feasibility plays into those particular use cases. But also think about your AI operations. So think about how you are going to monitor, how are you going to scale your AI, how are you going to kind of implement that ethical oversight across your AI use cases. Last of all, then, kind of the key takeaways for sort of developing that AI maturity. So focusing on those collaborative experiences. So we've seen massive success where we've run things like hackathons or agent-a-thons. They help to build confidence, they build momentum. People coming away feeling like they've achieved something, they've learned something, and they've got a new skill that they can then use to apply when they're utilizing AI in their day-to-day roles. Also focus on use case development. So, what mechanism works for your business? Is it collaborative workshops? Is it using things like Teams forms or other kind of platforms to kind of gather data in from the business, and really developing that organizational muscle for kind of fleshing out those kind of AI ideas. But also, focus on kind of the marketing angle, focus on promoting those AI success stories so that people are clear on where AI is actually having making a difference and having an impact. And people can then use that to kind of base their own expectations around AI. So that was a little bit about AI maturity. I'm now going to pass over to Stephen, who's going to kind of walk us through agentic AI, what that means, and kind of break down that buzzword for us. So over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. As Matt said, I sit within our advisory function. So the past 6 months or so, there's been a number of conversations Matt and I have had across different markets on AI, the topic, and various buzzwords. And agentic AI is definitely one which has been top of the list of things to talk about, and also one that I'm probably very guilty of buzzword bingo through various conversations as well. But really, that a lot of the genesis of our conversations is around how do you help organizations understand where they can go, how can they look at adoption frameworks, and we'll walk through that a little bit just now. One thing which is very important is to take a step back and look at where agentic sits in the overall evolution of AI capabilities. Now, I hope everyone does have their bingo card ready here, because the next few slides, there is a lot on here that you could probably mark off as we go. But it's important just to kind of think about where agentic AI sits and what does it really mean in terms of definition. So from the left-hand side, we have data science, where in actual fact, it's kind of the identification of insights from data, moving through more mature deep learning models, where it's looking at intensive, large multimodal data interrogations, and then the explosion of generative AI in terms of being able to apply logic and reasoning, so that the ability to get text generation and synthesis and the creation of audio and image generation. And then you get to agentic AI. And really what is important to make sure that is really clear in the context of this is the autonomous ability to execute tasks. So making sure that the fulfillment of that is executed, calls upon the right data when needed, and thinks about business logic as well. So gone were the days where it's reactive or prescriptive, but in actual fact, an agentic AI system is trained to use the right tools at the right time to trigger real world operations, which is incredibly important in terms of context setting. Next, we then look at the system that we would kind of talk to some of our customers to kind of help from an education basis. And again, some of this may be teaching people to suck eggs, but it's important in terms of making sure we're kind of clear on what's the right tool and the right solution for an organization at the right point, because sometimes we're trying to do sledgehammer to crack a walnut, where an agentic AI use case is the flavor of the month, but in actual fact, it could be a chatbot, it could be automation, or it could be a kind of RAG model of being able to kind of retrieve the right information on a linear basis. But this systematic diagram really kind of depicts what we talked about earlier on there, just around what is an agentic AI system. And there's some core concepts here that, again, we try to kind of make sure are really clear when we're having these conversations, because everyone's learning through this process as well. But an agentic AI system has the ability to plan, it has the right tools at its disposal, has the memory to be able to make judgment in that regard. And then it's around execution. So how do we make sure it has the right capabilities? How does it make sure it has the right information? And how does it then actually undertake some of the tasks, which are incredibly important in terms of actually bringing not necessarily just a solution, but return on investment, productivity gains, and benefits both to either customer and colleague, which really is the important thing that has to be at the forefront of any agentic system. Back to Matt's point around why we're doing it and what benefit it's going to provide. Some of the other conversations which are important, and again debunk some of the myths when we are playing bingo on a weekly basis, some of these conversations, is the different patterns and models that you can start to think about in agentic systems. And some will be very familiar with this, because I think in day-to-day life everyone's fairly familiar and adopting kind of AI tools. Pattern one we see very prevalent across both personal and work life now, where you have an AI assistant. If you think about some of the Copilot and Claude and ChatGPT, it's really driving individual and employee productivity, because they're able to do tasks faster, better, and probably slightly more informed. When we think about agentic AI, though, it then has to think about, well, what's the patterns that it gets into to truly orchestrate entire business processes and workflows. And that's where the transition point at the moment is we're still yet to see, I would say, a kind of a really true agentic system yet, where we're actually looking at a human-led, agent-operated organization which undertakes end-to-end fulfillment of tasks. That's a big leap of faith, and a lot to the stuff that Matt's talked about. You need a lot of foundations in place, which we'll talk about, both in terms of capability, governance, security. But really, it's important that organizations and individuals understand what the end state is and the transition states to get to that point as well. And one of those is around the balance of human to agent ratios as well. The balance of that, again, is incredibly important as well. Too few agents, and then, as you can imagine, underutilized, both in terms of the capability that an agentic system has and also the human resources being able to leverage that potential. So it's inefficient, and from a competitive standpoint, you kind of run the risk of being left behind. Too many agents and an over-enthusiasm, which again we'll touch upon later on, you can see where we get to the point where there's a real concept of humans being overwhelmed, inability to apply the right judgment, and really injects a huge amount of business risk into the system, where in actual fact we haven't really kind of thought about it. So balance of agents is important, and it does all stem back to the real purpose, the benefit, the use cases that Matt talked about, so that there is robust guidance and oversight to allow scalability, which is incredibly important as well. So what does that actually mean in real life? That's one of the things that we always bang the drum on. So we can talk for a while on kind of theory and what it means, but one of the most powerful conversations that we have is bringing it to real life with real world use cases. And there's three here that we talk about and demonstrate and kind of help and various conversations. So we talked about this earlier on around the ability to autonomously undertake a simple case to resolution. One of the examples from financial services, which is kind of my domain knowledge, is a change in circumstances. So when a customer calls up and has either changed address or has had something else change on their account, an agent should be able to autonomously complete that task. We don't need the ability to be able to speak to someone on the phone or undertake anything else anymore. So the ability to do simple case resolution, because it can actually then check various things. That also means it can check compliance as well. So in actual fact, is there the need for to check if anyone has changed circumstances for a particular reason in terms of financial crime? But that's a good example of actually where it's a simple case from a customer perspective, but there's a number of different checks and balances that have to be undertaken through the process. Quality assurance validation is one where we've seen a lot of conversations in the past, and a particularly kind of agents that run autonomously in the background derive a lot of value because it takes away some of the previous historic kind of manual processes that we used to observe. So upon various case completions, a QA agent can run in the background, which then immediately checks if all the necessary steps have been taken. It checks against sentiment analysis in terms of customer interaction, and checks against policy and regulation if need be, and then offers an opinion on score to be able to then think about, is there any training needs for an individual, or is there any compliance checks that we need to maybe think about updating because in actual fact the case took too long. So again, really good example of where an agentic agent can run, where it's removing some of the burden from an operational efficiency point of view, but actually providing real tangible insight to drive the business forward. And the last one, which some of our colleagues are probably sick to death demoing, is HR. Again, if you think about this as a multi-agent orchestrated process, you can have a series of agents that assess CVs, look at the right applications, and then start to actually schedule tasks. So scheduling interviews with the right people and being able to then bring the candidate information pack. So you've got a competency-based interview, which is already there and tailored. So again, removing some of the previous manual effort, but also making it much more tailored so it's not a prescriptive process that sometimes is going through as well. So there's some of the real live use cases. And then to bring it to life with pattern 3 that we talked about, and hopefully lead into Matt's next section, where we see things going as a true agentic end-to-end journey. And we tried to bring this to life with complaints because everyone's had to raise a complaint in their life, and also it's a kind of sector agnostic journey. You begin to see where individual agents are autonomous in their own right, but they are then interacting with one another to be able to fulfill a task. Either it goes from a triage of a case that's coming in to be able to assess and understand what route it needs to go down, then various lines of escalation to be able to understand whether or not actually a human has to interact with it at some point. We talked about the quality assurance, which again can run autonomously, or there are other parts within that journey that are an offshoot to think about the communication that has to happen either internally or with customers, and how do you then report that as well, either if it's a regulator or some form of independent body. You need to make sure you've got audit purposes as well. So this brings to life, hopefully, from what we started with as an agentic AI buzzword topic, how we begin to debunk some of the myths, remove some of the hype, and then step through it to make it real life in some of the examples and some of the journeys we're seeing across our interactions at the moment. And with that, I will hand over to Matt to cover off the next topic.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Brilliant. Yeah, so agent-to-agent communications, follows on really nicely from some of the stuff Stephen was talking about, particularly looking at some of those examples and those use cases where we've got sort of multi-agent systems that are built, with an objective in mind. They're built to kind of automate part of a process or an end-to-end process, and built to kind of take away some of that human effort. The key thing is, of course, though, that if those agents can't accurately and effectively communicate with each other, then a multi-agent system is going to fall apart very, very quickly. The other thing that we see is that where agent-to-agent systems are not communicating properly and not reliably kind of translating data, those kind of errors tend to cascade throughout that sort of pattern of agents and can really kind of amplify the errors that we're seeing. So we'll talk a little bit in this section about kind of what agent-to-agent communications is and is not, but also some patterns to approach agent-to-agent comms that will allow you to kind of actually have reliable kind of multi-agent systems that can communicate effectively versus things that tend to kind of fall over relatively quickly. So I think the key thing to talk about first of all, so a few kind of facts, if you like, around agent-to-agent communication. So we hear a lot of people in the kind of that are looking at agentic AI have queries around model context protocol, or MCP, and agent-to-agent communication. And it seems sometimes these two things can get almost a little bit conflated. So first thing to say is that agent-to-agent communication is not the same as model context protocol, MCP. MCP is a specific protocol for allowing agents to fetch context, as the name suggests, from various different providers. So you can think of this as like a suite of APIs, but they've been optimized for an agentic sort of platform to then go and get that information. Typically, that means you have your core API, but you then might enrich that with better descriptions, better information about what parameters need to be passed in and what the output might look like and what this particular API or tool call might complete for that agent. And that means that rather than a human having to consume that information and tell the agent specifically when to call that particular tool and what parameters to provide it, the agent can actually interrogate that information by itself and understand, right, when I call that particular tool, I need to give it these parameters and I'm expecting to get this result back. And that now ties into agent-to-agent communication, because by having that clear set of kind of ground rules in terms of what I pass to that MCP or that agent versus what I get back, allows you to have that reliable agent-to-agent communication. Another thing is that coordination breakdown is actually one of the leading causes of failures. And there's been quite a lot of research into the topic of looking at different agentic architectures, different agentic frameworks. And what has been really, really clear is that having a lack of kind of clear coordination structures between your different agents will result in sort of massive amounts of failure across those systems, versus where we have a proper architecture that allows us to really kind of supervise what those agents are actually doing. The other thing we see is that there are different approaches to this. So there are different ways we can structure our kind of multi-agent architectures, and that they can actually be tailored to the different outcomes that we're trying to achieve from that agentic solution. And we'll talk a bit more about some of those architectures in just a minute. But also, you can't get away from it in this day and age. How many tokens you're consuming, how much or what sort of prompts are being passed through your system is really, really important to understand. And obviously, if you have a malicious prompt, you suffer from a prompt injection attack, for example, if you have that agent system that is passing data from agent to agent to agent without any checks and balances, those tokens can rapidly ramp up, but also any malicious prompts through that system can get cascaded and end up with real problems across the entire solution. So one of the things to kind of talk about, so one of the approaches that seems kind of slightly intuitive, but actually is a bit backwards, is to kind of add more agents. Just by adding more agents to a solution, surely we can decompose that task further. We're going to break things down more. It's going to be simpler for everyone all around, and actually we're going to see that benefit. And that's actually a bit of an anti-pattern. It's what we call a bag of agents. It's where agents are just being thrown into a solution, given kind of different kind of prompts and different sort of bits and pieces, but without any real kind of coordination or kind of orchestration around them. Also, typically, we might see that there's no kind of contract or schemas that are telling one agent, this is what you need to hand off exactly to that agent, and this is what you might receive from that other agent. Without any of those kind of structures in place, then data can actually get very, very malformed very quickly. And that is going to lead to errors that are then again kind of cascade and amplify throughout your agentic system. Also, without a kind of a coordinated kind of orchestrator across these agents, it's very difficult to understand, are they actually completing the tasks accurately? Are they actually doing the things that we're expecting them to do? Are they fetching the data that we need to? Or again, are they kind of making hallucinations or errors and then cascading those down throughout the system as well? And again, if you look at the sort of the numbers behind this, so even if your agent has given a specific task and it completes that with a 99% accuracy, if you stack 99% accurate agents up over 10 steps, you're still actually only looking at an overall kind of system reliability of around 90%. And if you drop that down to things like, say, 95% over that same 10 steps, your agent accuracy of completing that task, which still a lot of people would think is relatively a good level of accuracy for an agentic approach, then you're looking at almost just under 60% overall system reliability for that particular piece. And if you extend that chain even further, so you've got kind of 20 steps or 20 kind of agentic processes all operating at 95%, you're then hovering around the 35% kind of reliability mark there. So you can really see how that reliability piece is really, really imperative, particularly as we start to scale out these systems and potentially look at longer kind of chains of logical processes as well. So kind of what are the things that we can sort of start to do about this? So we can think about the architecture behind these different systems. So the first one to kind of talk about is what we call a plan and execute architecture. And many people have probably heard or sort of been familiar with the kind of slightly newer version of kind of large language models that we're seeing at the moment, which are called reasoning agents or reasoning models. And these have the ability to almost kind of step back from a problem, think about the actual steps we need to achieve, and almost build up a kind of a stepwise plan of, first I need to understand the intent of this customer query, then I need to go and research some particular policies relevant to what they're asking about, and then I need to go and process that. Maybe that's update a system, maybe it's go and compose an email, whatever it might be. I need to go and take some action on that. So the way this works is that we have a kind of an orchestrator agent, which is typically one of our more powerful kind of large language models that are in the market at the moment. They will then receive that input, they will then build a plan, and then they'll use smaller, cheaper, more specialized agents to go out and actually do the work. So they're kind of distributing that work across their network of agents based on the specialist agents that they've got. And that's where that agent-to-agent communication kind of protocol comes into play. They need to be able to explain exactly what they need from each specific agent and what they're expecting to get back, so they can then maintain that context throughout the execution of that system. So when we use things like schemas and we use kind of constrained outputs, that allows us to really implement that very structured view of what agents are actually returning back when they're doing work for us. There's a little kind of example here on the bottom right-hand side. You can see the plan says extract intent. And we know that agent is going to then produce the values of intent, you know, what confidence score it might have, and maybe some quotes from the customer email, for example, that actually kind of flag that particular intent. And we can start to build up that picture for all of our different agents. We've got very, very clear understandings of what we're expecting that agent to communicate when it is invoked at the given time, following that plan. The next one is kind of almost like a super pattern of that sort of plan and execute. So it's called our kind of supervisor worker architecture. So here, rather than having a plan that is kind of pre-generated ahead of time, we actually allow a supervisor to slightly more dynamically kind of navigate the situation. So again, we've got kind of a supervising agent or an orchestrator in this place, which is typically, you know, one of our more powerful large language models again. And again, they're sort of then farming out different bits of work to various different other agents that are then going to go actually conduct those kind of more specialized tasks. But what this allows us to do is actually kind of validate and check all the responses that are coming back from those agents, but also allow us to sort of slightly replan or slightly intervene should something actually change with the way that we're actually expecting this kind of particular workflow to go. So really, really good if we've got things where there might be an escalation, there might be a change in plan as we go through, things might change underneath throughout that process. We've got that supervisor there who's able to kind of navigate that slightly flexible situation. And the last pattern is known as the swarm architecture. So this is where actually we remove the kind of the planner or the kind of the supervisor from the equation. We actually kind of focus around having these kind of smaller, more efficient sort of specialized agents that actually then go off and do their work. The key thing is we have very, very well-defined logic and very, very well-defined handoffs between each agent. So rather than allowing the sort of the planner or the orchestrator to try and make sure that we've got those bits in place, we actually focus more in on those specific agents and make sure they've got very, very well-defined schemas and kind of handoff points to when they have completed their task, and they'll pass it on to the next agent. And these are effective, especially good when we need to scale this out over high volume processes or, you know, those kind of repetitive processes that are actually relatively short-lived, but just can be automated relatively quickly. And of course, they can utilize smaller, cheaper models throughout, as long as we've got those very clear handoffs across that architecture. So in terms of kind of understanding when to use which model, so when we're looking at the plan and execute architecture, we find these are best used where you've got kind of clear goals, but you can decompose that into a sequential set of steps. So things like document extraction, we want to kind of parse through that document, extract key bits of content, maybe key topics, for example, and then process that into a workflow. So we can plan that out very clearly, and we can then hand that off to a plan and execute architecture to then go and navigate that plan and go and get all the things that we need to do in a relatively stable setting. In terms of the actual communication, so that will be handled by that sort of central plan, which is essentially farming out the work and then validating through schemas and contracts that the agents have processed that data correctly. When we're looking at the supervisor worker architecture, this is excellent when we've got situations that may slightly vary or have some sort of flexibility in them. So where we're kind of triaging customer support type queries or complaints type queries, as Stephen sort of talked about earlier on, there may be escalation logic we need to factor in that may change based on the type of escalation that we need or the type of issue that customer has particularly raised. So we might not be able to plan out all the exact kind of processes and steps at the start of the iteration, but we've got that supervisor in place to help us navigate that slight variance. So all that communication is then handled by the supervisor agent and validated dynamically following each kind of worker activity. And then with our swarm, so really, really good for where we've got high volume, well-defined tasks. Typically speaking, we're not looking at long chains of kind of logic here, but looking at those kind of high volume, kind of short tasks that need to be completed. So it's very good for things like interactive customer support type queries, set the query, fetch some knowledge, respond to the customer, all that kind of stuff. And all that kind of communication is then handled between each agent with that context being passed down the chain. In terms of just some good old-fashioned kind of do's and don'ts when we're looking at these kind of different agent-to-agent communication architectures. So things that we should be doing is enforcing contract and schemas. And things like LangGraph, things like Crew AI, these kind of agentic frameworks will really help you establish exactly what sort of state and what sort of data you're expecting to get back from each agent. So they can help you enforce those contracts and give you some really good kind of guidelines and kind of frameworks for setting those different contracts and schemas up to operate between your agents. Really important to think about sort of token budgets and enforcing things like max tokens across your agents as well. Understanding how much content you're expecting back from each agent and enforcing that rule will make sure that you don't accidentally have an explosion of token usage, which is going to cost a lot of money. And definitely thinking about how we can sanitize any inputs and monitor those agents for any interactions where we might see things like prompt injection that could get propagated across that entire system. In terms of things to avoid, so try and avoid creating long and complex chains that haven't got that kind of sufficient supervision or structure in place. So whether that is, calling back to a supervisor agent or a plan that's been generated by an agent, or even involving things like human supervision in the loop as well. But making sure we've got sufficient kind of supervision across that chain is really important. Don't get into the habit of creating really excessive retry loops or things like exponential retries, as they will rapidly consume tokens. So try and be a bit more intelligent about how we think about kind of tackling temperamental failures. And also, where possible, don't over rely on an agent to conduct. If you've got some very specific logical things that need to happen, an agent may not deterministically conduct that every single time. So don't be afraid to rely on traditional programming techniques or code, where actually you can express some logical steps in code very, very clearly to run deterministically the same every single time. So try not to over rely on agents if not needed. So just as a kind of a quick summary, so we kind of tackled three of the top three kind of buzzwords that we sort of discovered through our kind of polls that we put out there. So just to kind of summarize really, so AI maturity is all about developing sort of multiple aspects of an organization centered around AI being a key enabler for change and development for that business. Agentic AI is obviously an approach to AI that is specifically task and objective oriented, empowering agents to act autonomously and use kind of tools and knowledge made available to it to go and complete those actions. And agent-to-agent communications is a really, really important consideration when we're looking at agentic AI to make sure that we're building reliable systems that can scale and can kind of approach that use case in an appropriate way. So AI maturity really develops the foundations for the business. Agentic AI then delivers on that autonomous decision-making and kind of objective-oriented AI approach. And agent-to-agent communications is really a facilitator for making sure that agentic AI is going to be properly coordinated across those complex systems. So I'm now going to pass back to Stephen, who's going to kind of talk through an approach that we can start to look at that will help us kind of move from understanding some of these buzzwords in this sort of bingo format into the kind of building blocks we need to be considering when looking at agentic AI adoption.
Thanks, Matt. So just a couple of bits to finish off, because a number of these sessions people attend, and I know I feel when I attended that's great, but so what, and how do you take the next step? So there's a couple of concepts we wanted to just put on the table around how do we move from the hype and the buzzword into actually tangible actions and potential follow-up. So one of the things that we stress is it's incredibly important to think about what AI can't do and where humans are even more important. And I think leadership in that respect is even more important at the moment as well. There's three broad concepts just to really frame it. One is around kind of aspiration. So AI pursues goals, doesn't set them. Leaders really need to decide the questions that are deserving to be answered. So that visionary aspect is even more important than it has been in the past. Matt's mentioned a few times as well in terms of kind of ethics, but empathy, compassion, and judgment is a thing that I'm normally on my hobby horse about, particularly around human in the loop of some of the agent systems. I think that's incredibly important because there has to be an element of accountability, and you still need to build up trust. Therefore, human in the loop, either by design or by process, is still incredibly important as well. And creativity as well. So the systems that we've gone through today, they are really kind of looking at patterns in the past and being able to kind of generate solutions, recommendations, and insights. But innovation really comes from breaking through some of the barriers and thinking outside the box, which again, only humans can do. So that's really important when you think about organizational strategies and adoption. The other bit is what's the boring side and the bits that need to be done. So anybody that has young kids, trying to get them to eat their vegetables first on a daily basis is a challenge. And I'm normally thinking, eat your veg first, get it done, and then you can enjoy the rest of your dinner or enjoy a treat. So it's the same in terms of doing the boring side of AI. There is still a huge amount of hard work and foundations to be put in place before you really start to embark upon kind of AI adoption strategies. And here's a series of things which isn't necessarily exhaustive, but just to give you a flavour. The data and the governance, I haven't really touched upon it today, but I mean, it's absolutely sacrosanct in terms of having any kind of system which is going to be built on strong foundations. Even having things like value streams mapping, customer journeys, again, sounds fairly trite, but you need to have all those things in place. And one of the things that we normally talk about is how do you combat against kind of POC inertia or the kind of second project problem, as we've got in number 10 there. So just great ideas and it's not actually going anywhere. So there's a lot of things that have to be done from a leadership perspective to make sure the right foundations are in place. One of the things that again we frame with organizations is the balance we talked about with human to agent ratio, but also the balance between organizational appetite and kind of risk averse natures as well. So it's important to think about not trying to dampen the enthusiasm and experimentation, but having a balance between what does that mean from governance, guide rails, and controls. Too far one side, then it's either rework or chaos. Down the end, too far to the governance and kind of risk side of things, then you're really in the position where in actual fact things are going at such pace where you probably start to be left behind. So healthy tension between those is incredibly important. And then just two final bits then to finish off on different levels of how to really start to tackle this. This is a targeted adoption approach that we've got, and I really stress the word on proof of value rather than proof of concept, because I think there is personal belief. I think there's a kind of POC kind of avalanche happening in the market rather than actually proof of value. Back to some of the points that Matt made really well was around what's the use case, what's the problem we're trying to solve, how do we do it, and what's the value. So taking through a kind of structured approach like this helps to be able to then fit it in with a business case, but also actually an adoption strategy as well. So that's a very targeted approach to go from kind of buzzword to reality. And the other one that we have is a more enterprise-wide approach, which looks at a much broader perspective, which we've kind of classified as our kind of PRISM methodology, which looks at the enterprise in a series of components and tries to look at multi-axis. So looking at customer journeys and products, looking at the colleague processes, looking at your data maturity. And what that allows is the ability to ascertain tangible use cases and a roadmap, combats against POC inertia, and thinks about scalability. And it really helps with where is the most fruitful avenue of pursuit, because you can end up going down various avenues and maybe not being quite the right one. So this concept helps because it's not a formulaic rinse and repeat. And one other thing that we're seeing quite a lot is it gives the ability to kind of zoom in and zoom out, because the adoption of all the AI tools and techniques that we've talked about, it's not really a kind of linear process anymore. You need to think about things in a multi-axis way as well. So that was a whistle-stop tour of how do we advise and see things moving from buzzwords to tangibles, and just to kind of leave a few thoughts on the table in terms of any kind of future conversations. And with that, Matt, I think we have concluded, and we can open up and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you very much, Stephen. So yeah, just to quickly say before we get into any Q&A, so attendees of this webinar are eligible for a AI readiness and feasibility snapshot. This essentially is a lightweight sort of review of kind of where AI is at the moment in your organization, and give you that sort of perspective of things that you might want to think about in the future, things that you might be doing well already, and kind of different sort of recommendations of things to go and look at. But also a bit kind of check in on some of the different use cases and how feasible those kind of things might be. So giving you an understanding of where AI might add value for your organization, and how you might go about tackling some of those things as well. So hopefully some of the folks on this call will be able to sort of benefit from this this snapshot as well. So obviously please do get in touch with us should you want to take part in that. Other thing just to say, so just to kind of plug some of the upcoming sessions. So if you've enjoyed this one or any of the ones previously, we've got plenty more coming down the road as well. So for those that are maybe aware of FabCon or not aware of FabCon, so that is a sort of a data and AI platform conference, all relating to the kind of the Microsoft data platform Fabric. So that has been going on last week, I believe. So next week, so we'll be talking in the future about all the different releases and all the different sort of things that have been coming out related to Fabric around that. Also got a few others coming up, so specifically around police and the role of data and AI in policing, and then also looking at how we can transform business processes with that PRISM approach. So going into more detail about some of the stuff Stephen was talking about as well. So look out for these up and coming webinars too. Cool, so we have got a couple of questions. Stephen, there's one in here that I think is probably worth sending your way. So the question is here, so in the complaints example, would all of the agents be different or differently trained? Is there a risk of agents marking their homework, marking their own homework, e.g. QA agent versus first or second line agent?
Yeah, great question. I think, Matt, you touched upon some of the concepts to help combat that as well. So that supervisor orchestration agent is incredibly important in that regard when you get to the final state of actually having multiple agents. But there's a few bits, Bev, that we would advise to kind of support in that regard. One is pick the simplest, most straightforward agent to implement and embed effectively first. So what's the simplest agent? So it doesn't need to go from left to right. Like we said, we don't think those journeys need to be sequential in that regard anyway. There could be an agent which operates really efficiently in its own right. Then I think there's a really important part around the kind of human-led design aspect. So how do you build up trust that agents are not either hallucinating or going off and doing their own thing? So there has to be a series of approaches to be able to kind of combat that. But they do, my belief, they do need to be built independent of one another, to your point, to combat actually everything's just going to go straight through and it'll be great. But in actual fact, you need to build in an element of control and trust within the journey as well. So that monitoring and security, particularly from an orchestrated kind of agent leader, is probably the most important thing. But I think to be able to bring those journeys to life, it doesn't need to go from left to right. You kind of think about actually what are the areas where we think we've got a relatively straightforward process. So let's pick that one first and build them independent to one another.
Yeah, and I think just to develop that as well, I think from a sort of developer perspective, it's really important that you have benchmarks that are tailored around the different stages of a process. So in Stephen's complaints example, we've got a number of agents that are in charge of specific parts of that process. So whilst I talked a little bit about understanding the reliability of your system as a whole, we still need to be able to break it down into what reliability are we seeing for each of our individual agents and the tasks that they're specifically completing. So that's why we can really make sure that we can kind of validate that our QA agent is, 99% accurate across these types of cases. And so when we're developing these systems, it's really important that we establish those benchmarks and have, where possible, kind of automated evaluations around that, so that we can actually detect, are there pockets of sort of information or pockets of context that it struggles with that we need to refine. So it's really important that we see the system as a whole, but also we sort of see each constituent part as something that needs to be validated and monitored, and that how that contributes to the overall system reliability as well. Great question. I believe that's all the questions we've got in the Q&A, and there's no other buzzwords being requested right now. So I believe we can wrap it up there, unless there's any last second questions to get in. Doesn't look like it. Okay, well, look, all that's left for me to say then is thank you very much, everyone that attended the webinar this morning. We'll look forward to getting the slides out and kind of following up with you in the next few days. And as I say again, if you can make use of the AI readiness and feasibility snapshot, then please feel free to do so. It'd be great to kind of chat to you further about AI in your organizations and the different use cases you might find as well. But other than that, I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their day, rest of their week, and hopefully we'll see you on a webinar again soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.